We're now going to create the terrain for the forest. And before we start, we need to change our internal unit back to the default. So we're going to go to File and Options and set the unit to one view unit is 1 meter. Apply the new settings to the current scene and click OK. So this way, now we're working with default since we're no longer modifying plants at the moment. And what I want to do is create a standard terrain. And if we take a look at this scale, we have 256 meters by 256 meters. And this is going to be the default for all terrain types unless it is modified. There are two different types of terrains, a standard terrain and procedural terrain. Procedural being an infinite amount of geometry depending on its size in the scene and the camera's relation to the object. Both of these types of terrains will be created at the same size because it is the default. If you right-click on the standard terrain, or if you're using integrated Xstream within a host application, the command is height field terrain in editor. And what you can do is modify the size. So as you can see, 256 by 256. So we could modify that and change it all the way up to 4096 to 4096, which is the max size, because it is based on the pixel resolution. And for standard terrain, that does matter. So if I double-click on the terrain, and sometimes depending on where the pivot location is, where we can see the gizmo right now for the terrain, double-clicking doesn't always work. So you can right-click and edit the object, or just use the Edit Object command from the menu, or over here on the right. So up at the top, you can see 256 by 256 for a standard terrain. That is the pixel resolution. It's also going to be the resolution of any painted texture maps or painted images and distribution maps for the materials on the terrain. So I do want to increase the resolution. We can go up to the top and hit the ×2 button, and that's going to increase it to 512 by 512. Because there wasn't any data within the terrain when it was multiplied, you will notice that it will look a bit pixelated. And that's because it's resampling from the current resolution. The more we increase the resolution without having any extra details, you'll notice more and more of a blocky look and pixelated effect. So right now I'm going to click OK for the moment, and if we want to expand to a different viewport, if you double click on this on my screen, which is kind of an orange color because I'm modified my interface colors, which can be done in File, Options, Display Options, or actually in General Preferences, Interface Colors. I've got a different color scheme, so it will show up orange. I believe the default is blue. If you double click, it'll take you to the other editors or the other viewports. And some further customization for the viewports. If you go to File and Options, Display Options, there is the ability to use independent zooming and panning of views. Otherwise, it's going to be locked. So if I wanted to zoom in to just this viewport with that option off, it's going to modify the other viewports to match where this zoom level is. So I do like to have mine independent. It does work a little bit better. You can still frame all the views. So right now we have a selected item. Up at the top here, a couple of navigation commands, zoom in and out. I'm using the scroll on the mouse to zoom in and out. And that is going to zoom into wherever the cursor is within the top, side, and front view. It will not do that within the main camera view, or at least it shouldn't. We can also select an area. If we just click once, we can then drag and select a specific area. Or if you right-click, it'll just frame that selected object. Back in the options, the top option, Center Views on Objects Selected in World Browser, what that will do is if you select an object using the World Browser, it will automatically frame your object. Selecting it within the viewports will not trigger that command just when you click on them within the World Browser. So if you have that option on and you don't want to reset your viewports, just pay attention to whether or not you have that command on. So I'm going to select the terrain and modify the height to 30 meters. And up in the Numerics tab, just have that middle option selected, which is the scale. We can go down to Z, because I do have my Z axis as the up axis and not the Y. And I'm just going to type in 30. And because my unit is set to 1 view unit equals 1 meter, it's automatically going to set 30 meters. Also, because I do have the automatic mode on, units and coordinates, default display unit, metric, automatic, it is going to, based on the current sizes, it will automatically place in a specific unit without having to type in centimeter or meter or kilometer, based on whatever the internal unit is. So now we want to position the camera. I'm going to switch over to the top view, select the camera, and using the move gizmo. Now I have mine assigned to basically a thumb button on my mouse, so I can go between the 3 different options with one little kind of scroll button. So you may not see me click on the individual commands, but you can see the gizmo change. The difference between the size and the move are the boxes that show up on the ends. And of course rotation being the circles. So if you see me move quickly and you don't see whatever I use, just pay attention to the gizmos. And I'm just going to move the camera over here to the side, and I do have that lock height on, and I'm going to set it to 1.6. And I'm just moving over to the side of the terrain. We're going to switch over to the full viewport mode. Kind of move the camera over a little bit. And what I want to have is the camera kind of on the side of a ridge. And then if we want to use the camera control center, we can move the camera back and forth. And I also want to note that these can be a little touchy, depending on the scale of the scene. That can be very sensitive. So if you hold down the control key before you click, it will slow down the movement and the sensitivity of those controls. Go back to the camera and set that back to 1.6. So I'm just using one terrain right now as kind of the main terrain that's going to be in front of the camera. And then if we need to fill in with other terrains in the background, we can do that as well. Now, because I resampled the terrain before just by doubling the resolution, I do want to add a little bit of extra detail. Over on the left of the terrain editor, there are different options: mountain, peak, eroded, canyon, mounds, dunes, iceberg, lunar, the ability to mix this with a picture, and also an overall option setting which will allow you to adjust altitude distribution, noise distributions, and the internal fractal that is used to create the random noises that are placed to generate a standard terrain. You can also use the zero edge command to create more of a mountainous look and drop down the edges if needed. I just want something that's going to add a little bit of extra detail. If we go over to the Effects tab in the upper right, the terrain editor, we can also add some global effects. Some of them might be a little too intense, but just to add a little more detail, we could add some stones. And if we don't want these sharp peaks that are showing, if we take a look at the wireframe view, you can see we have some of the polygons being a little too vertical. We can always reduce some of that. I'm going to select terraces. And then up at the top, we're going to set up a little bit of an erosion. A lot of different types of erosion. I'm going to click Dissolve once. You can also click and hold down on these commands in order to continue applying the effect. You could do that with all of them very easily, except don't do it with River Valley because it takes a long time to process. I am going to use a little bit of the alluvium erosion. We can also set the rock hardness, which is going to be the effect power, or the intensity of this effect. Soft, which is all the way on the left, is going to make these effects apply a lot more, and you'll see them show up a little easier. So go back. I think I'm going to add some stones. And now the effects over on the left are going to apply and modify the current terrain. The intensity of that and the scale is going to be based on the resolution of the terrain. So the smaller the resolution, the more the effect will be applied. If I go and add the mountain preset, it's going to really add a lot of detail. It is also going to really change the look of the terrain quite a bit. So if I undo that and first increase the resolution to 2048 by 2048, then apply the mountain, what we're going to see is that pattern that is used is very small and can create an undesirable effect. Really depends on the terrain and the setting used. So instead what I'm going to do is just go back and reduce the setting. By doubling it and then bringing it back, it does tend to remove some of the blocky look of it. What we could also do is add a little bit of grit, and that just adds some finer detail throughout. So I do want to load in a material to use on the terrain as kind of a base material. And we'll be modifying the terrain more a little bit later, but first I just want to get a better looking material on this. And there are a lot of different ways to change the material. If we open up the material summary, we're going to see two different materials called default. One is the ground plane and one is the terrain. So if you're not sure exactly which is which, the best way to really choose that is to just select the terrain itself and go up to the top to the aspect tab and edit the material. At this point, we could also just double click on the material itself and open the advanced material editor. Or we can load a material, or use the load material command if you're using the integrated version host application. And that's going to open up our browser for the presets. What I want to load in is under material layers, and I'm going to select the dark grass procedural as kind of a starting point. We'll be modifying some of the colors of this. Technically, it's really not all that dark compared to some of the other materials. If we take a look at the color output, so if we open up the advanced material editor, go to the color production, right-click, edit the function, and we take a look at the output, it's not very dark. Some areas of it can get a little more dark, but for the most part, compared to what we can have set up, and really depending on the gamma, I don't believe this is all that dark compared to some of the other ones. But I do want to modify this and make it a little more interesting. Now if we take a look at the way the preview is set up, I also want to note too, I have the function node preview and output observer. So the preview is this XYZ output of the color. At the moment it is the color. If we switch over to a different node, it is going to, anything numeric will show us a nice little graph of our output values. And those are translated over into, by a connection of the color map, taking the lowest point of the color map, which is going to be the lowest point of the number, and the highest point of the number, in between the values of -1 to 1. Anything going beyond the range will be clamped and will not show. So since this fractal does go to 3, or starts at 3, and goes down to about -3.5, or actually in some of the axes it does go up to 3.5, the only thing that is going to control color is the value from 1 to 1, or 1 to -1. Anything beyond that is just not being used. So if we wanted to reduce that fast Perlin fractal, we could decrease the gain, and now we'll see more detail showing. And then the output observer will really show what's going on. So the higher the gain, the more the detail is clamped out. So I'm going to type in a value of 0.65 for the gain, and that way we'll see a little more detail overall. And now this is using two different color maps on two different fractals. The fast Berlin fractal up at the top has a really high smallest feature option, so the little fine details just really aren't there because the smallest feature is set to 1 meter. So it won't create any finer details below 1 meter. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that and bring it down just a little. And that just brings in some additional color. Going up to the render options, I'm going to set this to final for the moment, render to screen, and we can just take a quick look at what it looks like right now. There's a lot of really fine bumps that are showing, and that might be because of that smallest feature option. Overall, it's not a very interesting looking terrain nor material at the moment. Going to the bump is connected to the other Berlin fractal, which also has a really high roughness. Typically, not a good idea to use that as a bump if you're going to be close up to it. So we can also increase the smallest feature for that for the moment to see if we can get rid of some of those really fine bumps. And that did take care of the little grittiness and look to it. So I am going to readjust the camera a little bit just so we can see this edge of this mountain a little bit more, the edge of this hill. I'm going to bring down the camera a little bit further because I want to use some of these areas to kind of create a path going up into more of the hilly area. Check our main camera, set it to 1.6. I'm also going to select the camera again and change the focal length. I'm going to bring this down to 23 millimeters to expand our view a little bit more. And because standard terrains are really random in the way they're generated, in order for you to be able to follow along exactly, I'm going to need to save out the scene for you so that you can open it at the current state. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out. So if you do want to start up from this point, you can have the exact same terrain because regenerating it in the terrain editor is not going to be all that easy unless we were to start with a procedural terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out. Okay, I'm going to save this as Forest A1, and I want to note that we really don't have any additional texture maps in the scene right now, so the incorporate texture maps won't really do anything. But once we were to paint either on a terrain and distribute the material in the terrain editor or load in an ecosystem, that incorporate texture map option is going to be very important because it will increase the time it takes to save and also make the file bigger, and it may not be necessary. I typically only suggest using the incorporate texture maps when you have a scene that is ready to be rendered and more at the final point. I mean, if you have all your content together, then you really don't need to use that option if you're making small changes. So I'm going to turn off incorporate texture maps, and that will be remembered as we work throughout. We do have the ability to choose which texture maps are incorporated, and that's going to be important for any sort of painted terrain layers. And that can be done in the Links tab of the world browser. Right now, no texture maps, so we're not going to see anything showing up in there. So you can load in the terrain at this point if needed, or if you want to follow along exactly. So now I'm going to open the terrain editor. And what we want to do is create a path, and basically that winding path that goes up. And kind of winds through here, going up to the top. And in the terrain editor, it's a little difficult to see exactly where that's at. So up at the top, we do have the ability to view the scene, so show the entire scene. That's up at the top up here. And we can see where the camera is. So now we can see that area where we want to create a path. So what I'm going to do is hold down Shift and double click to where the terrain is. And then we can zoom in, and I'm just using the mouse wheel to zoom in. You can also use the top options. Shift and double click will place the pivot point of where the camera is and where on the terrain we're going to be looking. So this way we can kind of view around that same area. Although we can't look through the camera, we can get a pretty good idea of where everything is at. Viewing the terrain in the scene is going to show less detail. So we'll go ahead and turn that off and just kind of remember where that is at. So what I want to do is, in the upper right, we're going to force 2D. This is going to gray out all of the 3D sculpting brushes, because we're just going to be working with the 2D terrain right now, and just modifying the two-dimensional layer. We're not going to worry about any three-dimensional layers at the moment. And what I want to do is double-click on plateaus. And using the plateau brush, I'm going to turn off, in the global settings, the airbrush mode, and reduce the flow down to a pretty low amount. And then I'm going to drive the size with pressure, which is the button over on the right. So if you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet, you can adjust size that way. And then I'm going to reduce the scale, or reduce the size of the brush using the slider. Might need to increase the flow a little bit. And the size just a little. And just kind of flatten that out for the initial path. And if we want to make a little bit going behind it, and now in order to make the other path, I'm going to use the unislope. Reduce the flow. And I'm going to go ahead and drive the flow with pressure as well. And just set an initial size. And turn off the driving the size with the pressure. You can switch to flatten. And just kind of make a little bit of an indication of the path there. We can switch over to view the scene. And I think that's going to be a good starting point. And then we'll move on to just adding in the material layer. So we can add a material layer either in the material editor. So if we click OK and right-click, edit the material, we can go to add a new layer. Which will do that within the advanced material editor, or within the terrain editor we can go down to the lower right here and add a new material layer. Make sure we get our viewport back where we can see where we want to paint. And I'm going to add a new layer, and we want to select something that's going to be more like dirt. So we're going to go to the material layers, and I'm going to select the plowed land. Now we will need to modify the bump because this will give the appearance of plowed land, but it does give us a good color starting point. So with that new plowed land added in, what we can do is switch to the material brush, and it's going to show us the initial color, which is going to be that dark grass, and then the plowed land is going to show up brown. Now it's using the overall color from the material. It takes and just gives kind of a medium color of all of the colors combined. Changing that within the material editor will modify the color of the surface, but we can change it in the material editor and just change the preview. So I'm going to make that a little bit darker so we can see it better. And now we're modifying that material with the material brush. And if you notice, under the brush mode, we are no longer sculpting, we are just painting the material. So we can come in here and paint that in. Increase the flow a little bit. Now, keep in mind this is locked to that smaller 512 by 512 pixel layer, so I am going to increase the resolution of the terrain so we can get a better material look. And then just go around wherever we want the path and paint that in. You can adjust the fall off so it's not so harsh. It still does look a little bit blocky, but we can clean that up later. Just kind of want to rough it out right now. Increase the size. And then we also want to modify the top a little bit and have the path continue. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stick with that. Click OK. We may need to reduce some of that on the side because it is going up this slope over here, which I don't want to happen. And also it looks like the way it was being sampled before was a lower resolution. So now that I've opened it back up, maybe we'll be able to get it to look a little bit better. So we can switch over to the dark grass now. It still does look a little bit blocky. But we'll go ahead and subtract some of those areas. Click OK. And we can click on the preview on the right to see how that is showing up. Now if we want to take a look at the texture map, we can go over to Links tab, select it, right click, and if we go to the downsample, it will show us the size, which should match the size of the terrain. It does look like it's just going up that slope a little bit too far, or that it wasn't subtracted correctly. I'm just going to go ahead and push the camera in just a little bit further. We can make further modifications to that a little later, but what I want to do at the moment is modify that material. So we're going to select the terrain, and I'm going to rename it the material for the plowed land dirt. We can also see the alpha production showing for that painted material. Edit the function, and if we take a look, we're going to see what is creating that plowed look, which is mostly going to be connected to the bump channel. And it looks like it is caused by the sine wave. And the reason I can tell this is because anytime you remove the scale from an axis, and in this case we have 0 on the x and 0 on the z, it will create a straight line, and at least a sequence of lines. Now it's also connected to a little bit of turbulence, so it does have some variation, but for the most part it's going to be a bunch of straight lines. So if we convert this over to a different fractal, or convert it to a fractal, we should be able to get something that looks a little bit better for dirt. So what I'm going to do is over on the left, with this selected, I'm going to click on a fractal, and it's going to convert the noise to a fractal, and I want to change the pattern from that sine wave to Perlin noise, and we'll use a gradient. Click OK. You'll also notice that the scale has changed, where before we just had the dark grass procedural as 0.1, now the overall material is being downscaled. So everything is going to be reduced in size. If we just want per material sizing, what we can do is change the global, or the overall scale of the material, set it to 1, and then go into the individual materials and reduce them. So the scale of the dark grass procedural I'm going to set to 0.1, and then going to dirt, I'm going to set that to a scale of 1. And actually, we will use 0.5 for the dirt, so we can scale it down a little further. The bump map looks really intense, so we're going to go over to the bump channel of the dirt and reduce that to 1 from 4.5. Actually, go ahead and use 1.5. And we'll take a look at it, the way it's turning out at the moment. So we do need to clean up that image a little bit, because that alpha is too wide and is showing in some of the wrong places. Now, if you do want to use another application to modify that, you can export that texture map. Right-click, Export Link, in order to save it. Trying to open it right now, it is in basically in your temporary folder, temporary directory. Probably won't open the image, it'll just open up that temporary folder. So it's a good idea to export the link first, and then you can clean it up and import it back in, making sure that you do keep it in the same mode, which is going to be an indexed color. And that's mainly only if you want to continue painting on it within the terrain editor. If you just want to finalize it in another program, not worry about using the terrain editor, then you can use any image format you really want to use. Going back into the terrain and taking a look at the material, I'm going to zoom in a bit. I'm going to turn off the Force 2D mode. Make sure we are in the material brush, and see if I can get something that looks a little bit better that way, because at the moment, like I said, it's really not following along the way it should. So turning off Force 2D may help, but it looks like just those pixel blocks are still showing. We should be able to create something that looks a little better. So just switching between the materials, and I just want to reduce the look of that a little. It does look like it is showing up a little bit better. But just going along the sides, kind of removing any areas on the edges, increasing the flow. Maybe increasing the scale of the brush will help, just to reduce that. So it does look a little bit better now. And really it just needs to be cleaned up more along the top. I also want to make sure that the gamma is not affecting this. So I'm going to edit the function of the dirt material, and for that alpha that's being painted, I'm going to switch this and click on the little Y next to the image and override the gamma to 1, because we are essentially painting this in a gamma of 1, and we don't want it to be modified by the system gamma, which is controlled or will control all texture maps. But we'll take a look at that once we start getting the vegetation in here. So I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup, just kind of going along, removing some of those areas. I believe that most of the issue in painting here is due to the fall off. So what I want to do is increase the size and then increase the fall off, and I might be able to get a better working material here. And what I'm going to do is adjust the fall off filter. I'm going to reset the filter, and that is giving me something that works a little bit better. So that was really just caused by the fall off, because if you don't have a decent enough sized brush, it can cause some issues. So it's best in some cases to adjust the fall off rather than making the size of the brush too small. Especially when you're sculpting, you'll find that very small brushes will increase the resolution of the terrain. Since we're not working with a 3D terrain, we don't need to worry about that. The relation of the camera to the terrain itself can also make a little bit of an impact, but we're not really seeing much change at the moment. We'll go ahead and take a look, and that does look a little bit better. So we're going to keep this, and I'm going to go over to the Links tab, right-click on the texture map, and set it to Incorporated, which it's not going to let me do right now. So first we're going to save the scene. Forest 2, incorporate the texture map, and that will auto incorporate this. At least it should. And then if we need to, we can use one of the new Vue 9 commands, which is to copy all texture maps to a folder, just to get them out of the temporary directory. And in my case, that's on a different scratch disk. What I've decided to do with this texture map, because I was having a little trouble just dumping it into a directory using the new copy all texture maps to folder, what I decided to do was export the link, and then I called it dirt path and saved it as a bitmap, because a bitmap file is really kind of the default of Vue, and it's going to really be the best for the terrain editor for painting, because other image formats can show up incorrectly. So bitmap's the best thing to use for the painted terrain alphas. If you want to continue using painted, the painter and the terrain editor. Otherwise, you can just use any format you want, making sure that you connect it in the material editor. And after I exported the link, I did replace the link and then just load it in that material. So now it's called dirt paths, because exporting it will not automatically link them back up. It'll just export the photo. So now I can also double click on it and open it in my default image editor or viewer. In this case, I'm just using my Picasa photo viewer. And we can see the image map, and then if I want to open it up in Photoshop or another image editing application, I could easily do that, save it, and it'll automatically update too, because it is synchronized. So I can also go ahead and save this out, and I am going to choose not to incorporate texture maps, and that way it's going to draw from them. So then this map will be in the directory for this scene file if you load it in. So if you need to assign the texture map to the directory, it will be located with the scene, just called dirt path. And I'm just going to add one more material to the terrain before we add the ecosystem. So I'm going to do this in the material editor, edit the material, add in a layer, and we want some rock now that we're going to put on the steeper slopes. So we want to choose, I'm just going to choose a rock material, and I'm going to use the green, or actually the gray rock. Click OK. And if it changes the alpha boost, and what the alpha boost is an overall transparency. At 0, it's going to show the entire surface. So we can see that. And negative 50 was what it was assigned to. So now it's showing at 50% opacity throughout. But I do want it to be set to 0, and then I'm going to control its distribution using the Environment tab. And what we want to do is adjust this based on slope range. So the slope range goes from 0 to 180. In this case, because it is a 2D terrain, the slope range only exists between 0 and 90. 90 being pretty extreme, and we hardly have any areas that are going to be directly vertical. But anything below or going between 90 and 180 would be, or would only exist if the terrain was rotated, flipped upside down, or painted in 3D. So we really only need to worry about 0 to 90, and 0 is going to be the flattest point of the surface. So what we want to do is grab from the top, if you want to use the slider, and reduce that. If you need to change the preview mode, you can go to Options, Select, and I have mine set to Terrain. We can also change the size, the object size. Mine's set to 100 meters, and that only applies for using World Standard Mode or Object Standard Mode. Parametric modes will not apply. So let's go ahead and set this to a slope range of 55 to 90. And then the features that we have next to it are steep and flat for the fuzziness, which is a gradient and a blend to the other surface, or whatever's underneath it, in this case, the dirt and the grass. So we're going to set those to 2, just to add a little bit of a blend. And we're going to see how that turns out. Looks like the size is way too high. It was set to 10, so we're going to bring it down to 1. Maybe even 0.1. And we might need to add a little more bump to it. So go to the bump. And just looks like there's not a whole lot going on. This is a very large surface. So what I'm going to do is get rid of the metascale, because we're not working with a very large scene. So metascale, it will add additional detail and variation for larger scale, but we don't really need that. And I'm going to take the wavelength and actually go ahead and bring them all the way down to 1. Largest feature down to 3. Scale 0.5. And that should work a little bit better. I'm going to go back, take slope range, bring it to 58 degrees. fuzziness to 4 for both the steep and flat. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Might need to increase the fuzziness a little bit more to get those options to show up better, or get that little fade to be a little bit nicer. Of course, we are going to be modifying the other material still, just not a whole lot. To get a better idea of the scale, I am going to go to the material options and set the object size to 10 meters. And we can see that the scale really still is just not small enough. Maybe go back into the material, select that terrain fractal, bring it to 1 meter. Anytime the metascale is below the largest feature scale, it is not applied. So as long as it's below 1 meter, we're not going to see it. If you do want to use that metascale, in this case, it's just not going to give us a good detail on this material. So I am just keeping it below. And I'm going to set the Z wavelength to 1.3. And that should look a lot better. So definitely more detail closer to the camera. And farther away it looks a little better. It might increase the bump a little bit more. Now I also want to mention, because of where the path is located, it is underneath the rock material. And now that's not a big deal in this case because the path is on a very flat area. But if we did want to have that painted material on a steeper point, the rock would be going over it, and then the path wouldn't show. So what you would need to do is just select the rock and move it underneath the dirt, and that would guarantee that they're not going to overlap, and that way the path will always stay on top of the dirt, or on top of the rock, and you won't have rock overlapping it. It looks better that way, and that way we're not going to worry about overlapping any layers. Okay. So now I want to get rid of the green in that dark green procedural and make it more dirt and kind of the color of what would be dead leaves, and set it to something a little more brown. Also, we can increase the detail if needed, but for now we're going to worry about the color. So what I'm going to do is select the color map. You can go to edit it, so right click, edit. Now we could load in a different color map as well. If you want to double click, it will open up the chooser in the browser for any material maps you have, and you can go through. And now this collection is the asileFX color map collection. Lots of different color maps you can use. But let's go ahead and edit this manually. We're going to right click, edit the color map. Select our color. We can also, as of version 9, just set the RGB values if needed, or you can edit the color to open up the color selection, where we can also set up favorites. You can edit favorites and also choose how many columns you want to have if you want to have additional layer sets. Another thing you can do is just click and hold down with the left mouse button to pull up 3 different saturation values of different colors, so that way you can just click and hold and choose a color, and then when you let go, it will automatically assign it. So that does make it a little bit easier and quicker. So we're going to do that, and then go to the other material. Because these are being multiplied together, the left side is white in order to keep the other color map intact. So we're just going to go to the green for now, make that a little browner. And it does look like I created a new key point, so I'm going to delete that other color with that point selected, and then go to that topmost color and make it a little more brown. And then you can see as we manipulate the key point positions, it's really modifying the overall look. And I'm going to go into that first key color point and change the R value to 255 so it's a little more red. Go into the other map where we still have a bit of green showing, and we can just manipulate the look of it. Maybe make that a little more reddish brown. Now if it's too dark, and it looks like because of the way it's being multiplied, some of the areas might be showing a little too dark, we can modify the gain, or go into the multiplying color map and modify the settings for that in order to get it to blend a little bit more. The gain is already reduced to a very low amount, 0.05. We can set it to 0.02, 0.08, go a little higher, and then it makes it much darker. We'll just stick with that for now. So I can fine-tune the color a little more, maybe lighten it up in the color map, since it is showing a little dark, and the way that blends with the other materials doesn't look great. Or we can go into the material itself. There's two different ways we can modify that. One way is to just adjust the overall color, which is that approximation of all of the colors combined. If we lightened that up just a tiny bit, so to lighten it, we can raise it on the right, and then if I'm going to lighten it, I also want to desaturate it. So over on the left, we can adjust the saturation. Now, small changes are going to make a big impact on this, so keep it minimal. And then also in the Effects tab, we can adjust the diffusion. So I can bring the diffusion up to 70. Let's bring the ambient up to 50%. So 70%, 50%, and that'll lighten it as well. So that does look a lot better. And I do intend on adding an ecosystem to that grass on top of it, so we don't need to worry about exactly how good it looks, because it will be mostly covered up. If it becomes a problem later, then we can deal with it, but you don't want to spend too much work on materials until you get the ecosystem in, because a lot of times the ecosystem is just going to cover it up and it's not going to matter. And that way you're not wasting any time. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and then we can move on to working on the ecosystem.